Hello, everybody, and welcome back for another edition of Ukraine This Week with me, Don Arleth, bringing you the latest updates from the war in Ukraine. In this episode, we'll unpack the spectacular Operation Spiderweb, which took out 1/3 of Russia's strategic bomber fleet. And for that, we will be joined by George Baros, Russia team lead and Geospatial intelligence analyst at the Institute for the Study of War. Also in this episode, we'll look at the human safari that's been classified as war crimes and crimes against humanity by the United Nations. We are joined by journalist who broke the story, Zarina Zabrisky. But before that, let's go ahead and watch this latest report from Ukraine over the past week.
Ukraine carried out what appears to be the most bold and devastating attacks on Russian military hardware since the start of the war. The result? Up to 41 military aircraft struck, including strategic bombers. The operation, codenamed Spiderweb, hit air bases in Ryazan, Ivanovo, Irkutsk and Murmansk, some 4,000 kilometers from the front line. The method involved smuggling drones into Russia aboard shipping containers and launching them from trucks. These pictures released by Ukraine show the details of preparation for this unprecedented flurry of attacks. The Ukrainian attacks didn't stop there. A powerful blast struck the bridge linking Russia to occupied Crimea, using over a ton of explosives to damage its underwater supports. The SBU released footage of the explosion, calling it a blow to a vital Russian supply route. This week, the second round of talks between Russia and Ukraine in Turkey took place in Istanbul. While some modest progress was made at the meeting, there is still little hope for a ceasefire. Both sides agreed to exchange prisoners, and Ukraine said it would study the ceasefire demands put forward by Moscow in the coming days. One of the main issues that came up during the talks is that of the Ukrainian children, whom Russian authorities have reportedly abducted and deported to Russia. Ukraine's international allies have pledged to fully finance defense production by Ukrainian companies operating in allied countries. The initiative, currently referred to as Ramstein, Investment to Industries Initiative, aims to bolster Ukraine's defense capabilities by enabling licensed production of military equipment outside its borders.
We'll build drones, missiles, ammunition and other weapons together. Ukrainian drones have changed the battlefield, and now they will change how Ramstein countries prepare for future threats.
Ukraine came under a wave of Russian attacks this week, with civilians once again bearing the brunt of the violence. Russian forces launched one of the largest barrages of missiles and drones since the war began, targeting cities across Ukraine, including the capital Kyiv. The assault, which involved over 400 attack drones, nearly 40 cruise missiles and 6 ballistic missiles, killed at least 4 people in Kyiv alone and damaged residential buildings and critical infrastructure. A similar attack followed on June 6th. In Kharkiv, a Russian drone attack on June 5th struck apartment buildings, injuring at least 18 people, including children. The city of Sunumi, near the Russian border, also faced a brutal assault this week. On June 3rd, Russian rocket artillery hit civilian targets, killing 3 people and injuring 18 others.
And now, joining us to discuss Operation Spiderweb is George Baros, Russia team and Geospatial intelligence team lead at the Institute for the Study of War. George, it's always a pleasure to have you. Thanks for coming on this week.
Hey, Donald. Thank you so much for having me once again. It's always a pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. No, discussing, Operation Spiderweb, quite fantastic, fabulous attack executed by Ukrainians. It was apparently a year and a half in the making. Ukraine managed to strike and damage a significant number of Russia's long-range bombers. What do you think the strategic significance is of such an attack, and what's your assessment overall of what we saw last week?
So, couple of top-line thoughts. It's very consequential whether or not this was a one-time spectacular attack, or if this is going to be a new tactic that the Ukrainians can replicate across Russia to strike not only air bases, but other strategic objects that are deep in the rear, far away from the range of typical Ukrainian one-way strike vehicles. The other thought that I have is that this is going to be consequential for Russian procurement. Of course, the Russian military is in the process of reconstituting elements of its ground forces, but the Russian Navy also seeks to reconstitute some of the losses imposed on the Black Sea Fleet. And now the Russian Air Force is going to be getting into the procurement fight as well to try to replace many of its strategic bombers. So that will be an interesting budget fight as well. But to get to the first point, look, if the Ukrainians can now all of a sudden strike any airbase from an inconspicuous looking false shipping container, that imposes massive force protection requirements. The Russians have to build hardened hangars, they have to protect facilities, they have to screen, I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of would be otherwise civilian shipping containers just to secure their sites. I mean, that is going to be massively disruptive to Russian civilian logistics, if anything. In terms of the actual effects from this strike, it does degrade Russia's strategic bomber capability. It does degrade the Russians' capability to launch air-launched cruise missiles. This will not mean the end of strikes against Ukrainian cities, however. The Russians conduct strike packages that use drones, that use ground-launched ballistic missiles, and they use air-launched cruise missiles. Even if you were to remove all of the cruise missiles that are launched from these bombers, the Russians can still use drones, they can still use ballistic missiles. And in fact, most of Russia's strike packages over the last year have predominantly leveraged the Iranian drones. So it's good. It's an important degradation of a very important Russian capability. And I hope that the shipping containers will strike once again.
Yeah, hopefully they'll pop up at various locations. Now, there are also a little bit of conflicting reports on this attack. Ukraine's SBU says the strikes damaged 41 planes, while Reuters says that the U.S. believes that up to 20 Russian warplanes were hit and about 10 destroyed only. That's half of Zelensky's estimate. While Russia denies any losses and military bloggers report dozens of planes damaged, what is your assessment? Have you seen the satellite pics, or were you guys able to determine exactly the extent of the damage there inflicted?
Yeah, so we've been able to verify some of the strikes. From what we can tell, we see that from confirmed visual evidence, the Ukrainians have destroyed at least 11 bombers from what we can independently verify. But I think this is a lowball conservative estimate, as we're not yet able to image all of the air bases that Ukrainian forces struck, because many of those air bases are obstructed by cloud cover. So to do satellite imagery collection for electro-optical imagery, you have to have unobstructed cloud cover. You have to have preferable atmospheric conditions and a variety of other things. I'm not sure why there's there's a variety of reasons why there could be a lack of confluence between the American reports and the Ukrainian reports. It could have to do with the collection capabilities. I suspect the Ukrainians built their numbers based off of what they think their drone pilots hit with their actual strikes. And then, of course, there are limitations on what you can collect from not actually having been there. But I think we'll get clarification as the day continues. But even if you look at the lowball numbers, I mean, what we know that is confirmed, to lose 10 strategic bombers, Tupolev 160, Tupolev 95s, that's a significant degradation. I mean, these planes are not in serial production. The Russian Federation has not produced Tupolev 95 since the 90s. The Russians have well under 40 of these actually in operational service. And so to even just lose, to lose just 5 or 10 of them, these high value assets, that is a significant blow.
I'd also like to ask you about whether this was solely a Ukrainian operation. Was there any American involvement in this as far as intelligence goes?
So I don't know concretely, but my personal professional opinion is that this seems to have been a all Ukrainian operation. There's a couple counter indicators that suggest that there was no American involvement. The first and foremost is that the United States national security conventional establishment does not like it when the Ukrainians conduct military operations in Russia without forewarning, and particularly those operations that might target elements of Russia's nuclear forces, nuclear triad, because there's a conventional wisdom that states that when you degrade elements of Russia's nuclear triad, then you undermine some of the pillars upholding deterrence theory and strategic stability. I may or may not disagree with that, but that's a conventional wisdom. We know for a fact that the Ukrainians withheld information about their planned operation in Kursk when the Ukrainians invaded Russia in August 2024. We also know this operation was a year and a half in the planning. And we also know that Donald Trump took office and there was a transition in January. The Trump administration would have had to have been read in to this program had the Ukrainians been working with the Americans over the course of that year and a half of planning. And given this administration's approach to how it's taken, how to support Ukraine or how to put pressure on the Ukrainians to bring them to the negotiating table, I don't think conducting this sort of attack would be compatible with an American involvement in the planning stages, because I suspect we would have probably warned the Russians. The other counter indicator that we have, of course, is there's fresh reporting today from The Atlantic that President Trump, of course, was not pleased with the Operation Spiderweb because he viewed it as being disruptive to efforts to try to have peace with the Russians. So for those reasons, I think it's likely the Ukrainians did it on their own. That's not even to talk about the technical aspect. From a technical perspective, the drones technology the Ukrainians have pioneered, there's something unique about it that they would need American support for. The targeting and intelligence collection data, you don't need an American intelligence for that. I mean, you can image these sites with commercially available data sources. And then the creation of the fake shipping containers and then actually duping the Russian commercial truckers to take them to their designated sites, that is well within the capability of Ukraine's intelligence services to do on their own. So I don't know for a fact, but I suspect that there was no American involvement.
So it seems that President Zelensky did indeed have a trump card up his sleeve for quite some time. Okay, well, with Ukraine leading in low-cost warfare, innovation, bold, unexpected operations such as this, is it putting other countries on alert about asymmetric warfare and the vulnerability to their strategic fleets? I mean, this seems to me, as a layman, like a game changer for militaries and military planning worldwide.
Oh, absolutely. So typically when we thought about these, quadcopter FPV drones, small little cheap, $500 drones, we've always associated that with the lowest level of warfare, the tactical level of warfare, the level of warfare where you have troops in direct combat with each other. A platoon shooting another platoon across a field, that sort of thing. But what the Ukrainians demonstrated is that actually they can use these systems to generate strategic effects. They can take out reportedly up to about a third of Russia's strategic prop aircraft bombers. That's impressive. Not only that, they can do it basically anywhere in a country, regardless of distance. And that's a really scary prospect. Not for the Russians in particular, but for any nation, because we realize that these capabilities can proliferate. The United States and all powers, they now have to protect their own facilities from these similar cheap, replicable tactics, and that really nowhere is safe anymore. A lot of American air-based installations simply will have signs that say drones are not permitted to fly here. There's FAA regulations, so on and so forth, but there's actually very little in terms of the concrete countermeasures that can persistently protect sensitive equipment, sensitive installations from similar attacks in the future. So it has to get all of us thinking about the future of warfare. It has to get us all trying to internalize the lessons that are being learned and waged from the war in Ukraine and bring that home, because it's going to be relevant for humanity moving forward.
Yeah, certainly. Do you think that this will lead to, say, the United States having to really double, triple, or quadruple its efforts when it comes to protecting, critical assets like that are just parked on a runway at a military base somewhere around the country?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've been underlooking kinetic solutions to drone issues. The main go-to countermeasure for all drones in the American textbook has always been electronic warfare, but electronic warfare is not going to cut it, because you cannot run electronic warfare all the time. The systems are very energy intensive, and they also overheat when you run them for too long. So you have to decide, for what hours of the day are you going to have them turned on? For what hours of the day are you going to have them turned off? So we have to be thinking about hardened facilities. We have to be thinking about other kinetic defenses, such as nets, such as interceptors, and other kinds of solutions as well.
What can you tell us about the types of drones that were used? I'm seeing reports out there that that this is something kind of new in the shape, the design of such drones. Were they fiber optic drones? Was this why they were so successful? Or what can you tell us about the drones themselves?
So the drones themselves appeared to be not particularly new. I mean, they were human piloted drones that were remotely piloted by pilots in Ukraine. What was novel about it was the shipping container being the delivery device that carried the drones close to where they would eventually do their attacks. There's also an interesting, now that I think about it, integration of AI technology into these drones that conducted this attack. Because here's an example where you had a AI-enabled drone that was working in harmony with a human operator in order to conduct these attacks. So the human pilot was actually involved in getting the drone out of the shipping container, getting it to the site of interest, and then it also had some AI routine subsystems baked in so that if at any point in time the connection between the drone and the human operator were severed, the AI would then kick in and then use object detection to be able to confirm the silhouette or confirm the profile of the bombers that they were targeting. And then it would then be able to go in at that terminal end of that mission and finish the strike, even if the human operator was not there. So here we have not a completely autonomous system, but a system where autonomous features and a human operator together can get the job done.
Since this was a year and a half in the making, I'm curious, I'm sure you don't have a crystal ball, but is it likely that there are more such operations already in the works, similar ones such as these, and that we could see more such attacks in the future, in the near future maybe even perhaps?
What I've come to learn from studying the Ukrainian military for these past 3 years is to never underestimate the Ukrainians' ability to achieve surprise. I mean, they constantly surprise us. They surprised us with Spiderweb. They surprised us with the operation into Kursk. They surprised us with a reportedly subsurface drone attack into the Kerch Strait Bridge the day after the Spiderweb operation. They surprised us with very impressive deep strikes into Russia to take out large Russian ammunition depots. I don't know concretely what the Ukrainians are planning, but they plan and they conduct bold, successful attacks, and I would expect more.
Now, talking about the Kerch Strait Bridge there and the underwater explosion that we saw, well, it seems to have not been successful enough to take down that piling. But really, what is going to be needed for Ukraine to eventually take down this bridge? I mean, is it going to be something like the long-range Taurus missiles that we're still waiting on? Maybe this home-brewed long-range missile system that Germany has mentioned as of recent that they want to help Ukraine develop. What does Ukraine need to do to knock that thing down?
So I'm not a military engineer, but from my conversations with more qualified individuals, my understanding is that to take out a very large concrete superstructure, the likes of which this bridge is, it really requires heavy ordnance. And individual missiles like a Taurus missile or even a ballistic missile may be insufficient to take out the bridge. I don't know that for a fact, but that's my understanding. My understanding is also that if you really want to undermine the integrity of the bridge, you'd either have to get demolition teams who would target the foundations of the bridge physically there. The SBU claimed that its operators managed to physically mine some of the elements of the bridge in addition to what seemed to be a underwater drone attack. I don't know what to make of those reports. So that could be one way of doing it. The other way to do it would be you'd need to get heavy fixed-wing aircraft on top of the bridge to be able to deliver heavy bombs, the likes of which, the payloads of which were more difficult to deliver with just a missile. I think it'll be very difficult to destroy the bridge with Taurus missiles. However, from what we also know from the experience in Ukraine is that you can effectively deny the use of a bridge without necessarily completely destroying it in a catastrophic way. The Ukrainians succeeded in denying the use of the Antonovsky Bridge in Kherson across the Dnieper River in 2022 by not toppling the bridge, but by simply shooting it a lot with HIMARS and reducing the bridge's efficacy to be able to be used to ferry Russian logistics across the river. Perhaps if the Ukrainians got closer range and the ability to launch sufficient missiles, they could deny elements of the bridge. But perhaps they also have a theory for how they can undermine the foundations with a combination of remote miners or underwater drones. I'm not sure. We shall see. But it's a hard task.
So on the surface, it looks like this latest attack. Do you think it was underwater demolition or drone?
I really don't know because it's very difficult to collect in the underwater domain.
Right.
We have just one single video that showed the moment of the explosion. Ukrainians claim that there was an underwater demolition aspect to it. There's also some video that could suggest that there was a drone, but it's exceedingly difficult to tell you with any certainty.
Mm-hmm. I'd also like to ask you about Frederick Merz. He was meeting with President Zelensky last week. He said he made this announcement talking about the long-range Western weapons supplied to Ukraine, that there were no more limitations placed upon them. And I guess the question now is, why do you think that Frederick Merz would make such an announcement? Does Ukraine possess Western weapons that were previously limited in range? Have they all been used? Does this maybe point to something else, potentially that Germany will send certain elements to, let's say, fast-track the domestic production of Ukrainian long-range missiles? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, candidly, I was kind of confused by Merz's statement because without also sending Taurus to have that couple that statement, it kind of seems like the apropos of nothing, right? To my knowledge, there are no Western systems that the Ukrainians currently operate that are range bound. I mean, they have the permissions from the United States to use the American-used weapons within Russia. I'm not sure what European systems that the Ukrainians are operating that would have the relevant ranges for such a consideration to be relevant for the Ukrainians. I read that partially as perhaps an attempt to try to cajole or jab Washington into sending more missiles. I know that the Europeans in the past have, of course, been very hesitant to allow those sorts of strikes into Russia, and so by Merz publicly signaling that, hey, the Overton window on this issue is shifted. We are open to allowing the Ukrainians doing this. There's no more restrictions. They're trying to signal that they want to really continue proceeding with supporting the Ukrainian war effort. But in terms of a concrete system, I was pulling up hairs and straws at that when I heard it as well.
Well, I'm hoping, I mean, just secretly, maybe perhaps there's something that Germany could provide that would, again, fast-track the domestic production of Ukrainian-made long-range weapons. Then they can kind of, politically, they can get out of this. Well, it wasn't a transfer from the West, in the form of Taurus or ATACMS or something along those lines, but rather something that was developed domestically in Ukraine. Is that a potential theory? Is that possible?
It's certainly possible. And the Ukrainians are working on developing a variety of long-range strike missiles and drones and that sort of thing. I mean, they have a whole program that's designed to take the Neptune missile, which is a coastal defense missile, and design it to go and strike, I believe, in excess of 1,000 kilometers for long-range strike. And the Ukrainians don't just have the Neptune. I mean, they have a whole lineup of a variety of different drones that they are preparing to do that. I don't know where all of these systems are in their different development cycles and life cycles. The Ukrainians, for good reason, keep that all secret. Perhaps there's a place for German engineers or German capital to be able to support that effort, which would be very good.
Yeah, certainly. So Russia obviously doesn't need any excuses to strike Ukraine, but do you think that Friday's mass attack, or actually all these attacks that we've seen over the last several days, I mean, you saw some really big ones in Kherson, in Kharkiv, all over the country. Do you think that collectively this is Russia's response? We heard also Vladimir Putin tell Donald Trump during their telephone call that Russia would have to respond. So how do you think Russia is going to respond? Is this their response? We've been seeing this last week.
I believe what we're witnessing now over the last several days, including over last night, is the Russian response. They're intensified strikes, they're more intense strike packages, they're going after other cities, including manufacturing facilities in Western Ukraine, among other things. But really what this strike does show us is that Russia's options for escalation are actually quite limited. I mean, we've spent so long debating with ourselves and each other about Russian escalation management and Russia's options for escalation. And the Ukrainians once again decisively demonstrate that you can significantly degrade a pillar of Russia's nuclear triad, and the best options that they have for retaliation are really just, intensified conventional strikes against the kinds of targets that the Russians were already striking in Ukraine. It's not fundamentally different in terms of just it's a little bit more intense, but the Russians do these sorts of strikes every single night. So this is a response. I don't expect that we'll see anything much larger than this, or pardon me, not larger. We might see some more larger strike packages, but not fundamentally different from the kinds of strikes we're seeing now. And if anything, it should be a sign that, in fact, we should continue leaning into this because the Russian response options are so limited.
Yeah, exactly. Last question on this exact subject, and it's just something that I'm interested in because I've seen reports out there that say that these strategic bombers were lined up, visible on the air, on the tarmac, and they need to be so in convention with the United States so that they can be verified that they're not in the air flying to a target, something along these measures. Did Ukraine come in and, I guess, hijack this agreement between, say, the United States and Russia, that it knows where each other's strategic forces are? Or is this not?
I don't think they've hijacked anything, Don, to be perfectly honest, because, yes, these strategic bombers are part of Russia's nuclear triad. However, at the same time, they have a dual use. And the Russians, so far in this war, have decided to sortie these aircraft and have them launch payloads that are tipped with conventional explosive payloads and to strike Ukrainian cities. And so, insofar as the laws and norms of warfare and international law that governs warfare is concerned, these are legitimate military targets. They are used conventionally against Ukraine. The Ukrainians have taken them out conventionally. And so I wouldn't necessarily, I'd be very hesitant to try to read any sort of valence about Ukraine hijacking, nuclear security and stability treaties into this.
Yeah, well, I see statements out there, so I'd just like to get your read into that. And apparently these, some of these bombers were being readied for strikes on Ukraine when they struck. So that's that. Moving on now, we've seen we've seen Russia make some, better advances in May when it comes to the front lines in Ukraine than they've made in months. What's your current assessment of the front lines there? We see this wedge getting formed in between Pokrovsk and Konstantinivka. They're making gains near Kupiansk and in other areas of the front line. What's ahead for Ukraine over the summer months? Are we going to see another big Russian push or a summer offensive?
Yep, absolutely. So I think the Russians are currently preparing for their summer offensive. It might, in fact, already be underway. We're looking for indicators that would allow us to assert with greater certainty when we think we can call it, but the Russians are setting conditions definitely for their summer offensive, which might already be underway. The Russian main effort for the summer offensive, in our assessment, is indeed going to be Konstantinivka. We know that because the Russians have redeployed significant units from other parts of the theater to Konstantinivka direction. There were at least two motorized rifle divisions, the 20th and the 150th motorized rifle divisions, which were previously operating in the Pokrovsk and Krakov directions, which in the spring were redeployed towards Toretsk and Chasiv Yar. And that was a good indicator of Russian intent. Currently, we see the Russians trying to break out from the Pokrovsk salient, go north so that they can try to assault Konstantinivka from the south. We see the Russians trying to break out of the western outskirts of Chasiv Yar to try to assault Konstantinivka from the northeast and the east. And then, of course, the Russians are in the process of wrestling the final bits of Terezk away as well, so they can hopefully assault Chasiv Yar from, or pardon me, Konstantinivka from the southeast as well. So really, it seems like the Russians are trying to set conditions for a multi-direction, at least three-directional assault against Konstantinivka. And that is our assessment for the main effort. I will note that the Ukrainians did stop the Russian offensive in Pokrovsk. That effort has culminated. The Russians have deprioritized it, and it's to be determined to see how much progress the Russians will make in the direction of Konstantinivka. I don't expect them to seize the city anytime soon.
Yeah, and then there's the this buffer zone that they want to create near in the Sunumi region. They're currently occupying a few villages there on the border areas. What are your thoughts on this potential buffer zone and 40,000 or so Russian troops that are stationed in the area?
Yep. So there's a Sumy offensive that's ongoing right now. Part of the reason why, when you look at the graph of seized territory in Ukraine, why we've seen a recent bump starting in spring 2025, part of it also has to do with the methodology for counting the controlled terrain, because throughout late 2024 up and through March 2025, the Russians were really prioritizing eking out those final gains in Kursk and seizing all of Kursk Oblast, which the Russians largely achieved in March. And so since then, the Russians have snowballed their operation in the counteroffensive into Kursk. It is now the Sumy offensive, which has been ongoing. And that's part of the reason why, we're not counting Russian-controlled terrain towards seized Ukrainian territory, or rather Russian-controlled terrain in Russia towards Ukrainian territory. So that's part of the reason why the rates look faster. But in terms of the rate of advance, it's a little bit faster, but not as dramatic as it would otherwise seem. I'm very confused what the Russian operational plan is here, because the Russian command has not demonstrated the ability to be able to conduct multiple simultaneous offensive efforts effectively since 2022. What the Russian command typically does is they identify a single priority effort for their offenses, and that's where they'll put most of their resources. But their current operation in Sumy and the can also simultaneous setup for the drive on Konstantinivka, I'm not sure if the Russian command actually has the wherewithal to be able to successfully execute both simultaneously. I think the Russians have found some opportunities in Sumy. They're pushing towards Sumy city, but they do not have the strength currently required to be able to seize Sumy city. I expect they will get more of the fields and the villages and perhaps small towns in the northern outskirts of Sumy, but I don't think seizing the city is really in the cards at this moment, not without more Russian reinforcements going to that area of the theater.
Okay, well, George Baros from the Institute of Study of the War, thank you very much for joining us today and painting a very clear picture for us. We very much appreciate it. Thanks, George.
Thanks for having me, Don. Always a pleasure.
The human safari taking place in Kherson, which sees Russian soldiers hunting civilians with drones, has finally been designated as war crimes and crimes against humanity by the United Nations at the end of May. My guest now is a journalist living in the city who brought these crimes to light, first reporting on the phenomenon last July. And now joining me, I'd like to welcome American journalist Zarina Zabrisky. Zarina, great to see you, and thank you so much for joining us this week.
Hi, Don. So good to see you again. I know the TVP World was one of the first channel bringing up this important topic, and now we have both the United Nations Inquiry Committee report and Human Rights Watch report coming to the conclusion that human safari indeed qualifies as both war crimes and crimes against humanity.
Let's go back to July of last year when you first noticed that this was taking place. Just for our viewers, for some background, Zarina has lived in Kherson probably the longest since the liberation of the city than any other foreign journalist or any other even Ukrainian journalist for that matter. So Zarina, take us back to July of last year and how this whole thing got started and developed, and how'd you get it to your attention?
Well, speaking of journalists, today is the Journalist Day in Ukraine, a professional holiday. So my congratulations to you, to all my colleagues, everybody who helped covering Kherson. There were a lot of them. And of course, there are many Ukrainian journalists, amazing ones, still living in Kherson and doing the coverage. But yes, I happen to be, due to many reasons, one of them being the hard way of getting the access to the area. The one foreign journalist who lived there the longest, from 2023. And so I was used to any kind of sounds, which is artillery, tank, mortar, large Shahed drones, ballistic missiles, you name it. In July 2024, I first heard this terrible sound, which I always describe as a bunch of wet boards falling off a truck. That's how it sounds to me. And that is the sound of a so-called skid, the moment when a small commercially made drone, FPV drones known formerly for being used at weddings for entertainment purposes, drops a grenade, in many cases homemade grenade, an explosive down on a civilian or civilian vehicle or an ambulance, or sometimes a child or a dog. And that is how it started. Since then, I did a lot of research and found out and reported to you, Dawn, and on TVP World and other channels that not only the civilians become hunted, as Russian Telegram channels write about that in Kherson. There are other ways of using the small commercially made drones, such as setting the whole residential block on fire by dropping incendiary device. There are techniques like one drone would come and drop something heavy, make a hole in a private house roof, and the second drone will come and drop in the Molotov cocktail, and everything goes on fire. They also use anti-infantry band mines, small mines, dropping them off the drones in residential areas, and there are other ways of using the drones.
So after this started last summer, I mean, are there statistics? Do we know how many people have been killed, wounded, as a result of these types of attacks? I mean, we've seen tons of videos targeting civilians, ambulances, what have you.
Yes, the United Nations reports gives the number of 150 killed and hundreds of injured. Human Rights Watch gives a different number. I don't have it right now, but according to the military administration of Kherson, that would be about 150 killed and literally hundreds maimed by these anti-infantry mines, for instance, or injured by shrapnel of the explosives dropped by the drones, or sometimes drones exploding on impact. And I have interviewed and recorded and issued many interviews with people who were injured that way in the hospitals of Kherson, while hospitals were also subjects of such attacks. The drones would come and drop the explosives on the oncological hospital located very close to the now ruined Antonievsky Bridge. Eventually an aerial bomb destroyed this hospital. And even this week, there were many attacks on hospitals. In fact, after both reports were published, there were no verbal responses from the Russian authorities, but twice the buildings of hospitals were attacked in Kherson, and some of us believe that that was a non-verbal response from the Russian military.
Right, and of course, there's just this week we've seen the destruction of the main administration building there in Freedom Square, right in the heart of the city. We've seen that damaged years ago. It wasn't in use, but now, I mean, it's been, completely flattened. You can see that what it looks like on your screen. You've spent so much time in Kherson, Zarina, especially right there, right at that place. You've seen a lot of things happen there. How do you feel after this latest strike on Kherson?
Well, as journalists, we are supposed to look at facts, report them, do research, and I did my duty yesterday. I published an article in my newspaper Byline Times where actually I report that the Russian-appointed so-called governor of the Kherson Oblast, that is the Russian-controlled areas of Kherson region on the other side of the Dnipro River, was on the phone with Vladimir Putin, the president of the Russian Federation, as these attacks were happening, and quoted Putin as saying, quote unquote, closely monitoring the situation and praising the Russian military for their efficiency. So that raises the whole question of whether Putin could be accountable in the international court for war crimes as a military commander who knows of the crimes against civilians being committed. So there was a lot of reporting to do, but I have to say, as a human and as just a person who lives for 2 years, 5 minutes walk from this place, walks there every single day. And not only this building was destroyed, but my grocery store, my favorite grocery store, which is, you've been there, reported from there. It's like a beating heart of Kherson, sort of like a marketplace, was also damaged. My postal office was damaged. It is very difficult. It feels like part of me was damaged. You have to deal with these emotions as a journalist as well. So, but we feel even more as journalists reporting. In fact, many of my colleagues, Khersonian journalists from local publications, were reporting from the Freedom Square during the second attack, because they first hit at 5:20 a.m. in the morning, and then eventually many reporters and rescuers were there, and at 15:30, the aerial bomb hit again, and some of my colleagues and friends had to hide. They got very minor injuries, some scrapes really, but a big shock. And it's a big shock to the community, to the city. But the spirit is still the same. It's invincible Kherson. People are still strong, not broken.
And speaking of invincible Kherson, I got to preview a little bit of your documentary that you have in the works. It's just about to come out. It is called Kherson, Human Safari. I watched the first part. I'm only about halfway through, but it is a really detailed, well-told story showing what Kherson has been through since the beginning of the war. Now I've made it to the Human Safari part. What can you tell us about this film?
Thank you for bringing this up. Yes, it will be coming up perhaps already next week. We are talking to distributors now. The trailer is available, and we are telling the story of Kherson through Khersonian story. It's not a story of a foreign journalist arriving to Kherson. It's not a story of politicians, or not even the story of professional military. It's the story of the people. And for almost 2 years by now, I've been following my neighbors, people I know, and a lot of things were happening to them as we were filming. As you know, the flood, then the scorched earth strategy with the aerial bombing in fall 2023, then human safari, you name it, whatever could have gone wrong, it happened. The kidnapping of the kids, torture. It's all taught by these people, and I had incredible luck working with, say, director of photography, who is a very well-known Khersonian photographer, Alexander Andrushenko. His house is now stolen by the Russians on the other side of the river. He lives through all of this. We have a dancer, and there's this the small secret that people will find out as they watch, who lives through all of this as well. All these people are local. The composer who wrote the original music for the film, he was a partisan, joined the resistance movement during the occupation. And so each segment has a story, and I was just a medium to bring the story to the world. So I'm really looking forward to showing it to people and to try and make difference and stop these horrendous crimes that are happening now in Kherson region.
Well, from what I've seen, it's truly, it is a very remarkable, beautiful film. I highly recommend everybody see it when it comes out. And I thank you so much for doing such a work like that. American journalist Zarina Zabrisky, thank you so much for joining me today and talking about the people of Kherson. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Don. Happy Journalist Day to you and your colleagues.
And to you as well. And that concludes this edition of Ukraine This Week. Thank you all for watching, and join us again next week for all the latest developments from the war in Ukraine. Thanks for watching, and goodbye.